Recording. And let's bring up some text. Charles, would you do us the honor of reading our text about covenant with God, please?
I have to rearrange my screen here a second. All right. Starting with number 3 here.
Yes, please.
And Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob and declare to the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the children of Israel." This is from the biblical book of Exodus, right before God reveals the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. Here we have the covenant of God with the Jewish people. Some people are uncomfortable with the idea of the Jews as the chosen people, though it does not imply superiority, but rather distinct responsibilities that anybody else is welcome to join us in sharing. Thus, this text suggests that the Jewish people have a relationship with God. Many modern thinkers suggest that each people can have a special relationship with God if they so choose, just like a parent can have a treasured relationship with more than one child. Does this way of thinking about God work for you?
Okay, thank you. All right, thoughts on the covenant of God with the Jewish people? And does it work for you?
Thing that always upsets me is when something, I personally have not done this, but when people have something not so nice happen to them, they tend to blame God. And, like if a baby is born sick or their husband dies or their, God forbid, child dies, they get angry with God. And it's like they forget about the good, wonderful relationship that each of us have with God. But I just see so many people doing this. It's like the parent that if the kid does something good, they say, "Oh, my wonderful son. If he does something bad, then he's a rotten kid." So I suppose that, that's a similar kind of thing also.
Yeah.
Instead of just turning to God and say, "Help me with this," they get angry with God.
The world belongs to God. I wonder why he treats it the way he does. In that right now we have a lot of problems with the lack of water in some places, storms that are doing damage, or at least what we consider to be damage. Maybe he doesn't.
Yeah, maybe we did it to ourselves.
So maybe all people are chosen, but we're not doing such good making such good choices. This response seems a little bit of a post-Reconstructionist Judaism attempt to get away from the concept of superiority. I think if you'd asked Jews what the concept of a chosen people were a couple of hundred years ago, they would have suggested we were somehow chosen to be a superior people. And I think, that doesn't sit well in the modern era. Obviously, Mordecai Kaplan, said that was not a proper concept, the chosen people concept, and got rid of it in Reconstructionist Judaism, though it's now come back some in this framework that all people have a special relationship, and we have the concept that there are certain things we're chosen to do. I don't know if it's as the Jews or as individuals we should think about that and what we're chosen and what our responsibilities are.
We were chosen to be a people that would be teachers unto the rest of the nations. Not that we were superior. We just had the knowledge that God gave us that we were supposed to impart with the other nations. I wouldn't put that in the superior mode, I don't think.
Mm,
No, and if you're talking, you're on mute.
But how many Jews, how many of us, or say in other generations, I know I've had the sense, I share this conflict about saying we're superior, and many times that was actually the attitude in many Jewish communities. So it's a, to me, there's some conflict there. Just personally, whether can I accept that we're chosen, we're superior, and and many times people project that, and in a sense, well, how many times have I heard it say, well, look, we're a small percentage of the total population, but how many Nobel Prizes proportionally we have, how much we contributed? They see that's maybe true, but sometimes the way it's expressed, it can be interpreted as, oh, we're better than everybody else, or maybe it's because we just focus and cultivate that. But I have some conflicts there with that, so I don't know if it's the way that I would really think about it. If it works for me, yes and no.
It may have led to anti-Semitism, if that was the teaching. And as the Christian community became larger and more diverse and had their own ways of looking and thinking of God and how he or she related to their way of belief. I don't know. It does sound elitist, I feel, in some ways.
Yes. Well, for us as Jews, if we think about what was happening in the Inquisition or even before then, how many times have foreign nations come in and tried to impose because they thought their way was better. And we had to submit or be subjugated to their way of thinking and their belief system. So that's where I have this conflict.
Charles, I think it's really important to what you're saying. And I think, the construct that each people then, each religious group somehow thinks that they have the truth. They are the chosen ones with the one truth, rather than that each has a way of seeing things, and that there isn't a single chosen people or a truth. And so even the concept that we have been given something that we should teach to the whole world, rather than that we should share and learn from the whole world, is this elitist construct that I find what you're talking about, Charles, very difficult within the chosen people concept.
I heard it put that God chose the Jews because the Jews chose God. With the Christians, they choose Jesus and salvation, and the Muslims, they choose Muhammad and submission, but we chose God.
Very good.
Yeah, but for the Christians, Jesus is divinity, or an element of it, depending on which theology, which one of the spectrum of theologies you consider. And I'm certainly not an expert, but that's the sense that I get. And then you have all these saints with certain supernatural powers or senses, quality. So I'm getting off track. I'm sorry. But this whole idea is one of the things that causes so much conflict in the world, and the concept of whatever people it is that has their sense of being superior. And it just, I think it's the root of the cause of too much sorrow.
So being chosen people can be also a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, it's a good thing to feel that we've been chosen, but other people dislike us for that reason. So it's, you know, it's a positive and a negative. Like Carol said about the anti-Semitic piece.
I would just want to mention, my wife is Christian. I occasionally attend church services with her. And if I were to keep a tally on how many times Jesus or Christ is mentioned and God is mentioned, there are a good number of times that Jesus comes out ahead of God. I mean, it's just an observation, you know.
I watched the funeral of this young policewoman the other day. By accident, happened to turn it on and I became captivated with it. And like you, Jim, the liturgy was more Jesus than using the word God. That they were as if he were the creator almost. The way it was a Catholic service, and I'm not real familiar with the Catholic liturgy, but it impressed me that way. God was not the person, the entity that they spoke to or asked for comfort.
I think that that I don't want to get into the doctrine of the Trinity, far be it from me, for sure. But if Jesus, if Jesus as the risen Christ is a person of God, then you can't contrast him with God in that way, at least in some of the Christian theologies. And so I do want to say that as I understand Islam, which I only do a little, but whatever else is said about Muhammad, he's not divine and he's not God, and that's terribly important to the Muslims, even though they have a prohibition or developed a prohibition on images of the prophet. But in our own Sedur, I mean, in the Sedur currently used at Har Zion, in the section of the Amidah that says, in the paragraph that says, it contrasts the Jews with the uncircumcised. It's in smaller, if I recall correctly, it's in smaller font, and it says some congregations skip this passage. So these are very deeply conflicted, and I think Alan Rosenberg's point about how to understand this text and the discomforts is really important to acknowledge and not try just to paper it over. Not that you're trying to do that.
Other thoughts on this text before we move on? All right, let's go on to what we know about God. All right, Steve, would you please read this text, please? Right. Steve, are you there? No, Steve is not here. All right. Never mind. We'll ask someone else. Oh, would you read this text, please?
Glorify and praise the living God, who exists but not in time, singular and unique, hidden and unbounded, having no body, not a physical being. We cannot describe God's distinctness. God existed before everything. First of all, there was no beginning. This is the master of the world. All of creation points to God's greatness and sovereignty. Prophetic inspiration was bestowed upon the people God treasured and honored. There never arose in Israel another like Moses, a prophet able to see the very likeness of the divine. By the hand of this prophet, trusted in God's house, Torah, a truthful teaching, was given to God's people. God will never alter the divine law nor change it for another. God knows our innermost thoughts and foresees their consequences from the start. Excuse me. God repays the righteous for their deeds, punishes evildoers in accord with their transgressions. The divine will send us our Messiah at the end of days, redeeming those who wait for the time of God's triumph. God, with great mercy, will give life to the dead. May God's name be praised forever. I thought so. These are Rambam's 13 Principles of Faith adapted into poetic form. This form is sung at the end of Friday evening services, as well as at the beginning of morning services, as in a prayer called Yigdal, because that's the first word. The principles try to encapsulate some ideas about God. Some people have trouble with the idea of God bringing people back to life when the Messiah comes. This can also be understood as people living on the memories of others, or the trees coming back to life after they appear dead in the winter. Which of the ways of thinking about God work for you?
All right. Shrink the
That
text.
first one, what does it mean, but not in time? God exists, but not in time.
Is that number 4 or was that a different one?
Number one.
Number one.
Number one.
Number
Oh,
one.
here we go. Number 1. I think so. Recognizing that I am neither Maimonides nor God, my interpretation of this is that it means that God existed before time began and will exist after anybody is continuing to keep track of time.
And also after time ends,
Right.
whatever time is.
But he does exist in the time that we exist in as well.
Yes.
It sounds like what the existentialists would say.
That's true.
Well, it's like, it's actually to me, and I some day I'd like to have this discussion because I've been thinking a fair amount about this concept of is God of this world or of the universe. And it's again, is he of this time or of all time? And, the concept of God, of all the universe, and if we think of all the universe, we seem to be very pre-Galilean in all religions, but in Jews' perception of God. And what I mean by pre-Galilean is it's totally us and earth-centric. Here's this huge universe where one small planet amongst this galaxy of thousands and thousands of galaxies. And why do we then have this concept that we're the center of everything, we people and the Jews and ourselves? If he's across time, why is everything built about an Earth's calendar around 7 days, and a Shabbat is the 7th day, and a lunar calendar and things happening, which again are all earthbound concepts. And so the concept of God as being of the universe rather than an earthbound manifestation of us And beyond time, why would it matter, if he created in 6 days and rested on the seventh? It's beyond time. So all of this seems, has conceptually troubled me. I mean, I don't want to suggest that I can't sleep ever at night because of it, but it doesn't quite all fit. It seems very human-centric and Jewish, our people-centric, that we've created for ourselves, and it comes in conflict with number one and in conflict with concepts of the universe. Sorry if that took us a little bit away from Maimonides, but the Rambam's 13 principles, but 1, 2, 3, and 4, you really bring it up to me.
But one way of approaching that, Alan's point, it might be this: in the guide of the perplexed, or at least as far as I've gotten in the learned introduction of the translator, I see that Maimonides, well, he didn't write it in this form, but he did have these I would say dogmas, but they were for the multitude. They weren't for the learned, and that was surprising to me at some point. That because yes, he didn't believe God was corporeal, but to have all these characteristics was hard to reconcile with his philosophical notions. But it was harmless and a good thing morally for the people to believe these things. Now, a lot of people have taken that view of religion, but I hadn't realized that he had. So I guess I've gotten away from the spirit of the question, so I'll stop there.
But thank you for helping this perplexed.
Having no body, not a physical being, we cannot describe God's distinctness. Then how can we be created in his image if he doesn't have an image?
It's his image of us.
Well,
It may not be the physical image, it may be the mental image, if you will, in that once Adam and Eve ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, that the image that God created us in is the ability to reason and think and use our minds.
Let's look at, get a refresh run some of the other ones. Other ones of these that do or don't work for you?
Number 10, God knows our innermost thoughts and foresees their consequences from the start. I remember when I was a little girl, even age 4 or 5, my mother used to tell me, don't ever do anything bad because God always knows what you're doing and also what you're thinking. In fact, I've told that to Rabbi Glick many times. He quoted that the other day. He says, yeah, Norma always tells me that. But I believed it. Every time I wanted to do something that wasn't 100% okay, I thought, uh-oh, I'm going to be in trouble. Not with my mother, but with God.
Number 11 is problematic because it says that God punishes evildoers in accord with their transgressions, yet text says that God punishes the children of the evildoers to the 4th generation. That isn't punishing evildoers in accord with their transgressions because the children didn't transgress. So why are they being held in punishment for what their parents did?
It seems to me that seeing your child in pain for something that you know is your fault is a punishment for many people.
But how many people are around to see their grandchildren or great-grandchildren, especially in those days?
That's true.
Well, especially in those days, generational gaps were shorter. People had children sooner, and it was a question of child mortality, but generations were much shorter in historically.
Yeah, but people didn't live as long either in many cases.
So that's actually a bit of a, they wouldn't live as long, it's true, but once you survive child mortality, which really skews the average of lifespans, then chances are you would live to at least 60, assuming that you weren't, a man going off to war, or a woman dying in childbirth. But this is also getting way off topic.
It's hard to square number 11, and you could argue about maybe the translation of it, but it's hard to square that a notion with the book of Job or with a lot of other experience, surely. And so, without having the afterlife to balance the books, it doesn't pay for people. And you find that those who feel that it does have to do really extraordinary, and sometimes in very good faith, extraordinary mental gymnastics to show that it all works out even in this world. So it's hard to see Maimonides thinking that was anything more than something that you have to have people believe, because it's so useful and very difficult to order society without something like that.
Also says that God repays the righteous for their deeds. Well, the text says it repays them for 1,000 generations, which means that for 1,000 generations, if somebody along that line does something evil, does that mean they are not punished?
I think, you're saying that if for 1,000 generations, if someone 1,000 generations prior did what behaved morally, then are all the evil people in the next 1,000 generations off the hook?
That's what it reads like.
The text that you're thinking of says extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, which could also mean I being God will just be slightly more patient with you for the sake of your ancestors, the Zechut Avot concept that we see in the beginning of the Amidah. But that doesn't mean that you are off scot-free. And the history of the kings of Israel bears that out, that there was punishment even if God waited a little bit longer because of righteous ancestors.
We still haven't got to the 1,000th generation yet. I want you to go.
If I might interpret it in a somewhat less literal construct of God actually repaying us, but that our being righteous is our manifestation of God, and thereby by being righteous, we are manifesting it, and that is how we get repaid for righteousness, that we are, by doing such, manifesting that which is godly in humankind.
Right.
And we are running antithetical to that and to that which induces the godliness of humankind when we do evil, and therefore are outside, punishes is a hard word for me, but we sit outside the concept of godliness when we do evil. And what is the potential for us as human beings to do good. Just a little bit less of a literal God doing it to us, and rather a manifestation of God within us is sort of, how I can sort of true this one up in my own belief structure.
Other thoughts about any of these that do or don't work for you?
They're short of dog.
But these,
I never thought about this, until I read this. Now, God existed before everything, first of all, but with no beginning. Those 1, 2, 3, 4 words, I think, are very strong, because we just, from little kids learned about God, but no one ever said where he came from or how he came to be. So I think by just saying there was no beginning, it makes a lot of sense to me. God was just there. I also see many things. I have a lot of Jehovah Witness clients, and I see a lot of the things in this that they have used in there's a bench in Oak Park that quotes a lot of these things, saying that all ye, and it names all the bad things that people can be. If you find the truth and follow the good path, you will go with God, and you will be redeemed, and you will go to heaven, where the rest of the people will not. But there's a lot that they have taken from us.
Interesting.
if you go that way, you will see that so many of the prayers that have just been transformed and transfigured a bit, depending on whatever
Christian
denomination or what
yeah.
It's with slight adjustments. But I'm sitting here looking at this, and I'm saying, and so people are holding Maimonides in such high esteem, and I'm saying to myself, this is a very intelligent man who's very skilled in different areas, and he was a philosopher, but he's just another person as we are, except he might have had certain more sophisticated or more ability to think abstractly than I can, at least in thinking about some of these things. So maybe he wasn't always right. Is he infallible? It was just his system. I'm listening to this other some of the other folks here, and they have their own systems, and who's to judge? I'll throw that out for you. So sometimes I don't know if it's really worth agonizing over what he says, whether what he said is right or wrong. If it works for you, great. If not, I'm sitting here thinking, and maybe that's my pragmatic engineer's mentality, but.
Well, the fact that he wrote a guide for the perplexed was probably his own way of trying to find answers for himself.
Right.
We're all perplexed, really.
Yeah. But I can see some of these things as talking about what is earth-centered, and I'm centered on earth. I have no place else to go, but I look up at the heavens, and I can see where, and you look at the sights, the images you get from these telescopes that are far-reaching, and I can think and appreciate boundless and never-ending, at least in our relative sense of the millions of billions of years. Time, what is time? So, and where did it all come from? So I can appreciate some of this, even though there's other things that might be contradictory to what would seem to make sense to me. So it doesn't have to be 100% one thing. At least for me, it doesn't have to be.
We may not know the origins, but certainly we don't. And probably never will. But we do know that as man developed and evolved, these are things that were manifest by man trying to come up with answers. And as it got written down, it created more and more opportunity to try to understand. So God, in my mind, I do pray, but I don't know what or who I'm praying to. I see what the world, what man has created, and that's almost as hard to understand. I don't know, it makes me wonder.
All right, let's go on to something else from Maimonides. Steve, would you read our next text, please? I think that you're back now. Or did you get thrown off again? Nope,
No,
you're
I think we're here.
great.
Positive or negative ways of describing God. God can only be described in the negative, but God isn't. Rambam, Maimonides. According to Rambam, 1135 to 1204, a little less than half an hour, any attempt to describe God puts a limit on God. Only by describing God in the negative does this not happen. Does this way of thinking about God work for you?
Thank you.
Half an hour.
So this is my way of remembering the dates of Maimonides' life. 1135 to 1204 sounds like 2 times, so it's a little less than half an hour. He actually lived a little less than 70 years, but they sound like 2 different times. So, thoughts about the idea that we can only describe God in the negative, what God isn't?
I think it would be take just as long to describe God in the negative as what he's not, or what God is not, he or she, as it would to take to describe God in the positive. I mean, what if God is omniscient, omnipresent, all-knowing, all-powerful? What is there that's negative about God? Can there be anything negative?
Sometimes he's punitive, it seems, or threatens you with punishment if you don't follow the command. Takes away the rain and the oil.
That's something that
But is this saying that you're talking about God's, or you're talking about the negative things that God has said or done, or is this you're saying that you can only describe God by talking about what God isn't? I mean, we don't know what God is. We can't say God has blue eyes or hair, a physical description. But we can say God doesn't have a physical being. And I'm just thinking about it, not that God does negative things, but that we can only describe God by thinking about what are the characteristics perhaps that we normally would think of that God doesn't have.
If you say that you cannot describe God as having blue eyes, can you describe God as saying that God has no eyes?
We don't know if God has eyes.
Exactly. So trying to describe the negative is no easier than trying to describe the positive.
I really agree with, to me, I have trouble with this concept, so it doesn't work for me, David, to the question.
Great.
Because the reason is that I think by describing what you're not a woman, just many people, is limiting. And in some ways it's limiting in ways they don't want to be limited. In these times, you're not you're not of Chinese descent. That's limiting. And so I don't know why defining somebody by negatives is any less limiting than defining them by their positives. I want to think about that some more, but it seems like you could define people in the positives just as easily as you could in the negatives within reasonable limits. So I have a hard time with this one. Doesn't work for me.
It may even be more limiting, David, because if I say, David, you're not a gentleman, that's very limiting. If I say you are a gentleman, I think that's not quite as limiting in the positive sense.
Is it more limiting to say God is not in an empty backpack than saying he is in an empty backpack?
Good question.
I mean, who are we to describe what God is, negative or positive? God just is the way I look at it. I wouldn't think about trying to describe him as negative or positive. God is.
We've always said that the idol that the stone idol that somebody worshiped is not a God. Yet we as Jews have said God is in the stone as well as in everything else. Isn't there a dichotomy there?
I think that's an ends versus means question. That if you say that God is if you say the stone is the journey to get to God, that is different from saying the stone is the God. And there's a midrash about that that attempts to describe how idol worship came to be if originally everybody knew God. And it describes it as saying that Enosh, one of the early characters in the Bible, tried to say everybody should view the sun as a manifestation of God's power and God's gifts to us. And then people either got confused or got lazy or something, but just started worshiping the sun instead of worshiping God with the sun as the reminder.
But if the stone is the pathway to God, then it would not be wrong to worship the stone in terms of asking the stone to intervene, if you will, for God, any more than it's worshiping Jesus to intervene for us with God, for the Christians.
Hey, why do we have to make everything so complicated? That's the trouble I have with this particular.
Because we're Jews and we like to argue.
Yeah, I guess.
Maimonides is saying, I think, that the attributes ascribed to God in the Torah are not to be taken literally. It's one, and I think Norma's question before, who are we to say what God is and isn't, is a really good question. And if you start with if you start with the Torah, you have a problem. God is merciful, God is angry, God is jealous, God changes his mind, he repents, but he does use it. And quite apart from the physical attributes, that's really heavy stuff. And when you take it all away, you're left with a very big abstraction. And that's really hard for people to worship or obey or let alone have some kind of relationship.
Because we're all so concrete, Phil, is that it? Everybody wants to be concrete.
Well, that's why we have God who gave his only begotten son, who should believe on him should have eternal life. So there was a need for and that's a Jewish idea, that there's a need for a more concrete manifestation, or at least that there was that view.
That it's something they can see. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Or is God?
Well, I mean, it's very hard to worship an abstract and remote God. And there's plenty of reason to think, I mean, the Jews had this feeling themselves. There's lots of evidence of that. And they kept backsliding. What is that?
One difference, I think, is that the Jewish concept of the Messiah is not that the Messiah is the Son of God, as the Christians have think of Jesus, if you will. So I don't know that we would be worshiping the Messiah. It would just be another prophet, if you will, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I have quite a few young Christian clients right now who have a really hard time with Jesus because they go to parochial schools and they say, we're not praying to God, we're only praying to Jesus. And they don't like that. In fact, they're not even sure they believe in God at this point. There's a lot of questioning of these young kids, these kids that are like 14 and 15. It's a tough question, I guess.